Hello, Alex.
Hello, Tom. How are you?
I'm well, thanks. Good to see you. We're
Well,
expect
good to be seen anywhere. I'm just getting over COVID.
Seriously, you
Yeah,
okay?
so
Yeah,
I'm okay. I feel a lot better than I did yesterday, but it's
good.
been about 10, 12 days. So
Wow.
anybody else watching the Blue Boar Tavern, don't get too close to the screen.
Good advice.
We're not going to share glasses tonight. No,
No,
no passing the
Good
glass
advice.
around games. No.
What I
got my own
missed.
glass.
Oh,
Good.
okay.
Good
Alex
to
is
see you, Dorothea. Good to see you,
Good
Phoebe.
to see you too.
Unfortunately, Bono won't be with us this evening. So, um, welcome to our live audience, which probably needs no introduction to the Shakespeare Oxford Fellowship or the Blue Boar Tavern, but also welcome to those of you who may be viewing this program on YouTube in about a month's time or so and may have no idea who we are. So, for those viewers, very quick background, which can be easily expanded on by going to our site, shakespeareoxfordfellowship.org, where you will see that we are dedicated to investigating the Shakespeare authorship question and disseminating evidence that Edward de Vere, 17th Earl of Oxford, 1550 to 1604, is the true author of the poems and plays published under the pseudonym William Shakespeare. But why? Surely the man from Stratford had to be the author because every high school teacher and every English department in every university in the world tells us that, not to mention all the orthodox biographies. But when we look at primary source evidence, we find that although Stratford-on-Avon's William Shakespeare, spelled S-H-A-K, no E, S-P-E-R-E, as he was baptized, has roughly 70 primary source documents attached to the various spellings of his name. Spelling was not consistent in early modern England. Not one of them documents him being an author. And those documents are mundane records of business transactions, property bought and sold, tax delinquency, lawsuits, and the like, but have no literary associations whatsoever. And although the name Shakespeare was printed countless times on plays and play reviews and the like, not one reference is linked to a flesh and blood human being. Not even his family members, including his son-in-law, Stratford's Dr. John Hall, and a copious diarist, ever left a record of Will Shakespeare being an author. In fact, since the invention of the printing press, the man from Stratford is the only supposed author amongst all the authors of the time for whom all the evidence is posthumous and ambiguous. If the act of writing were a crime, there wouldn't be enough evidence to convict him. Now, academia shrugs this off as irrelevant, but we Oxfordians don't. We think it's bizarre. When we look at the enormous numbers of parallels between the life of Oxford, who was an author, and the works of Shakespeare, we can't help but follow the evidence to its logical conclusion. So please go to our site, shakespeareoxfordfellowship.org, to read more about us and the fascinating life of Edward de Vere, 17th Earl of Oxford. So everyone, that's the elevator pitch. Now, back to the tavern, where this month we take on the topic of Shakespeare's villains. That's Shakespeare the author, by the way, not the man from Stratford. And I'll kick off the proceedings with a very basic question. Somebody, how do you define villain?
I'll take a first stab at it and let everybody else elaborate. For me, a villain has two purposes. One is obviously as a foil to the hero or heroine, right? Making them a more complete person, showing up their shortcomings, allowing them to shine. And if the plot includes vanquishing the villain to be vanquished by the hero, and for those plots where the villain wins, to vanquish the hero. But I think the most important is to move the plot forward or to kick the plot off. Without the action that, or the situation, psychological or physical, emotional, of impending doom, a story is very boring. And so villains serve a structural role inside of almost every story, even if it's sometimes hard to find the villain. Without them, we have no action, we have no tension, we have no play.
Sometimes the villain is known to the protagonist. I would agree with what Dorothea said, that basically the villain is somebody often who's working at cross purposes to the hero or the protagonist, wants to do them harm or accomplish a purpose that's antithetical to what the protagonist wants to do. But sometimes in plays of all kinds, dramas of all kinds, as I said, sometimes the protagonist knows who the villain is and the fact that the villain is up to no good. Other times, the protagonist does not know this until very late in the action. Classic example being Othello and Iago. Othello is really fooled by most of the play, doesn't really catch on until unfortunately, until it's too late. Another thing I wanted to just point out briefly about Shakespeare, not that he's alone, but it's very, very interesting, is that he has lady villains. Not all the villains are male, and also that sometimes the villains are the title characters.
All true.
That's cool. Yeah. I guess maybe I'll kind of throw in something that I was having a conversation with a friend of mine, I think last year, and she's like from like a Soviet Russian background, and so like kind of much more like cynical in terms of how she kind of relates to the world. And I always really like, I don't know, Shakespeare's really optimistic, and I think that there's a sense in Shakespeare's plays that the tragedy it could be averted if everyone kind of knew everything. You know what I mean? If communication, sort of like a rom-com, even Romeo and Juliet, which is obviously a tragedy, but it could have been a rom-com. You know what I mean? Like if everyone had the right information at the moment, tragedy could have been averted. And I think that's very characteristic of Edward de Vere's sort of nothing is truer than truth outlook. And it was interesting having this conversation with my friend who has a very much more cynical perspective of this idea that maybe it's naive, or at least it's even naive or not naive, it's certainly optimistic, or it's not inevitable that a writer should hold that as a perspective. And then that's the theme that kind of pervades the works. So it's like the villain almost doesn't know the whole picture, or they're an agent of kind of suppressing parts of information, which if all of it was brought to light would result in, comedy.
So is there an uber villain in the works? If so, who?
Is there, did you say they're an Uber villain?
Uber villain.
One Uber driver? No, I don't think there's any Uber drivers in Shakespeare.
And how are you getting home, Alex?
Get a lift there, Alex. Thank you.
Do it early for that. Well, I mean, everybody seems to. I guess everybody might agree that Iago is like the quintessential villain. If you Google Shakespeare villains, he usually comes out at the top of the list. By the way, that's exactly what I did when I was researching for this show. When I started a couple of days ago, I thought, well, let's see what Google has to say. So according to NoSweatShakespeare.com, these are the top 10 villains, and I think they're ranked from 10 to 1. The Queen in Cymbeline, Angelo in Measure for Measure, Lady Macbeth, Macbeth, I think I had them slightly out of order. I put them together because they're in the same play, of course. Regan in King Lear, Claudius in Hamlet, Tamara and Aaron in Titus Andronicus, Richard III, and at the top of the list, as I said, Iago.
That's interesting. When I was listening, I was thinking, oh, Titus Andronicus, like I'm sure whoever, like that's going to be pretty villainous. Like if you're talking about very kind of carnal, like, not just gossiping in a malicious fashion, but like, really doing pretty grotesque torture types of activities. That's pretty villainous.
Yeah, but there are two, right? In Titus, you've got Tamara and you've got Aaron. They're lovers, and together they create the bloodiest play in the entire canon. I mean, even bloodier than Hamlet.
Yeah. And of course, Aaron, for Oxfordians, is a very close name to Arundel, Arundel. And so certainly many Oxfordians see the character of Aaron the Moor as Charles Arundel or Arundel. And Percy Allen, who I've been rereading, one of the early Oxfordians who wrote several very, I think, interesting books early on, 100 years ago now. He makes the point that when the mutilation of Lavinia occurs in a hollow ground that's mentioned like by 16 different terms, and the one term they don't use is Dell. And so he's wondering if it's Arundel by omitting the word Dell. Is that yet another clue, or is that just too much of a stretch on Percy Allen's part? But anyway, for those who may not know, the Arundels and the Howards were arch enemies of Oxford early in the 1580s because of the charges that they were Catholic sympathizers, and they leveled countercharges against Oxford, accusing him of everything from child molesting to well, just about any crime you can think of. There were so many charges that they were almost ludicrous in number.
We don't want to get flagged on YouTube, so maybe.
Yeah. I think that for me, when I think about Henry Howard and Charles Arundel, the two villains that come to mind, and they are subtle villains and a little bit stupid, but it's Rosencrantz and Guildenstern, the friends of Hamlet, right? There are certain villains who are really friends. They're kind of, cached villains, but they are in the employ of Claudius. And Claudius, for me, is Leicester, pretty clearly. So the Howard and Arundel are in Leicester's employ. They get together behind the scenes when Oxford outs them as having Catholic plots against the Queen. They get together with Southwell. They all compare their notes. They dash down what they're going to accuse him of. And Southwell says, I can't say this. And Howard says, you have to. And Southwell says, no, I never saw it. I can't say that. Oops, that comes off the list. But this whole sense of betrayal by friends, and ultimately Hamlet's only choice is to kill them. When Arundel and Howard come against him, ultimately he has to turn them in and really turn them in. It's like Hamlet on the ship, learning that Claudius has handed Rosencrantz and Guildenstern instructions to give to the King of England to kill Hamlet. And he has no choice but to use the signet ring, rewrite the letter, and send Guildenstern and Rosencrantz. Or is it sweet Rosencrantz and Guildenstern? It's that sense, too, that there is some difference in personality between Arundel and Howard, but they are kind of Tweedledum and Tweedledee when you look at it.
Yeah.
Guys, I'm going to jump in here because I want our participants, our attendees, to have their voices heard too. So if you don't mind, I'm going to read out some of the comments. Some are just comments and some are suggestions. And so we'll start with Tom Goff here. Other minds are opaque to us. That's one key problem Shakespeare wants to remind us of. Joe says, think of those soap opera villains that my grandma talked about. Richard III, says Catherine Stevens. Jim O'Sullivan, I hate Iago the most. Randall Fellows, Iago, the only one with the rhetorical skills that match the authors. I like that comment. John Beatty, but one form of real tragedy might be where protagonists do have completely adequate info, yet cascading misfortunes transpire anyway.
Yeah.
Ron, where's Goneril? She has to rank with her sister at least.
Yes, I agree with that.
I've got more comments to read, but go ahead, complete that thought.
Oh, no, I didn't know. I've spent some time thinking about which one of those ladies is actually the more villainous. And you know what? I think they come out even. I think they are a matched pair of harpies, the combination of them. Particularly when they both go after the same guy and end up dying for it. So,
yeah.
Well, it's interesting. Wikipedia's quote category of villains lists both Goneril and Regan among the villains. They have a larger list. This was just the top 10 from No Sweat Shakespeare. Maybe Goneril sweated.
Yeah, maybe.
Maybe she
No,
did.
Alex.
women don't sweat. They glow.
They glow. They're just glowing.
Right.
Well, this is, I don't know, just in terms of like villains, like maybe one of my favorite lines in all of Shakespeare is in King Lear. And it's this kind of unnamed character, the first captain, who basically Edmund charges, with, I think killing Cordelia, right? Like in prison or whatever. And I guess, yeah, taking her out. And I think he has this one line, he goes, "I cannot draw a cart nor eat dried oats. If it be man's work, I'll do it." And then he goes to do that. And just for me, like the kind of the compassion, I guess, or just the empathy with that character who, again, like if it was like a Star Wars movie or something, this is like some stormtrooper thug guy who's just like, oh, the bad guy. And then like, Edward de Vere has him speak this incredibly poetic line, I can't do what a horse can do and, eat what a horse can eat and pull a cart. So if it's man's work, I guess I have to do this dirty job. And it's to me, just a stunning moment of deep empathy. For somebody who could be a monster, is about to go kill this woman.
Let's throw some more in from the comments here. Ron again. Who could forget Edmund? Catherine Lear's with villains. Iago is the only non-title character with the most lines in any play. I learned that on Jeopardy. That was from Jim O'Sullivan. Hotspur. Interesting. Iago is named after the Spanish name of St. James, Santiago. There is a Spanish legend around him and a mythical battle against the Moors that earned him the nickname Santiago Matamoros, St. James the Moorslayer. What a background for a villain. That's from Jens in Germany. Arundel was exiled and died penniless. Alex, one for you. Right on, read Percy Allen. Jim Warren's Allen book has been a constant on my nightstand lately. Tom Harrigan. Tom Goff, Percy Allen deserves close reading, yes. David, Nufa, the list brings to mind the villains in Oxford's life. There we go. Ron again, Howard and Arundel's slanders are the basis for Alan Nelson's demonography. That will be of Edward de Vere. Tweedledum and Tweedledummer, more likely. Tom, villains may win, but losers can be heroes. Then who is the female arch-villainess for Oxford? Good question there from Catherine. Ron, could Maria from Twelfth Night be counted as a villainess? Her letter got Malvolio into that prison after all. David Richardson, Brolis is thought to be Roland's York, the retainer who convinced de Vere that Elizabeth was not his, might also inform Iago. John Beatty, slanders, but do scholars have consensus on how many of the Howard Arundel slanders may have had some actual basis in fact? And we'll leave it at that as
leave it at that. All right.
For the mill for you all.
All right. I'm going to start and say that I took a look at this from the point of view of people in Oxford's life. And I think, speaking of the female villain, since that question was raised, I think a lot of it is Marie de Medici. Marie de Medici was the Dowager Queen of France. She had 4 sons. France is in and out of frenemyship with England, after all. Between friend and fiend, there is only an R that makes a difference. I think that's an apt description for France. But nobody could forget 1572 and the St. Bartholomew Day massacre, where she and her son Charles enabled the slaughter of, the highest number I've heard is 10,000 French Huguenots. It's probably less than that, but Walsingham and Philip Sidney were in Paris at the time. They had eyewitness front row seats, unfortunately, to literally defenestrations, slit necks, soldiers, the Queen's, Catherine de' Medici, running down the street after mothers and children of Protestant Huguenots in an effort to literally wipe Protestantism out of France. And all of this following a wedding that was supposed to bring together a Catholic princess and a Protestant duke to join in marriage and solve the problems. And so when I take a look at Lady Macbeth, I definitely am channeling Marie de Medici. I see her in The Queen in Cymbeline as well, in terms of a mother who will do anything to promote her sons. And that's what I think Marie is about, those four boys, and then she loses them, which is tragic. But I see her there as well. I think there's, for me, Gertrude is kind of a plus minus. One of the earlier versions of Hamlet had a much more warm and motherly relationship between Gertrude and the Prince Hamlet. But in the final version that came out, we'll call it the first folio version, because I don't think there are any bad quartos. I think those are only earlier drafts. She definitely is a very conflicted figure, but I don't think she's a villain at the end of the day. So there's my answer. The only other villains, and this is just in my own head. I love the three other being sisters in Macbeth. They definitely kick off the action. They never use the word witch. They are prophetesses. They certainly act like witches. But I can't help when I see them. I look at them on the stage. I read it every time. And I see Mildred Cecil, Anne Cecil Bacon, and Elizabeth Cook Hobie Russell. The three of the five Cecil sisters, I see them as those weird sisters. I can't help it. I think they're behind the scenes with their machinations and their political network everywhere.
Well, I don't know if you're reading these comments. They're coming in fast and furiously. But April says, in the book, The Villainous Hero in Elizabethan Drama, the author discusses the role of conscience in the villain's mind. Macbeth is at the pinnacle of sympathetic villains, but we also see conscience in others. For example, Edmund. Can we discuss De Vere's possible identification with conscience-stricken villains and need for self-redemption? And then adding on to what you just said, Dorothea, Tom Goff says, Catherine de Medici makes a good villainess. I think Mildred Cecil, Lady Burleigh, would have had a chilling effect on De Vere at times. There you go. There's lots more for you to kick around if you'd like to. Great comments, everybody. Thank you.
No, I think that's a beautiful point. Sorry, Alex just raised about, Edward de Vere, and obviously the kind of redemptions of Hermione or Hero, being slandered, and, kind of, I think, Leontes clearly I think maybe that's part of why the plays are so compassionate, is that he's flawed and has mistakes that he repents for.
Two things. One, Dorothea, I would say, Eva Turner Clarke, another early Oxfordian who wrote hidden allusions in Shakespeare's plays back in 1930, which is another tour de force. She agrees with you 100% as far as Catherine de Medici as the prototype for the Queen in Cymbeline and Lady Macbeth. An interesting point about conscience, Edward de Vere's own conscience. I think it's Percy Allen. It's either Percy Allen or Eva Turner Clarke, because I read them both within the last 24 hours. In Measure for Measure, at least one of those two sees both the Duke and Angelo as manifestations of Oxford. The Duke, who's leaving town for a while and leaves Angelo in charge to enforce the laws, is the mature Oxford. In his later years, looking back on Angelo, the younger Oxford, who is much more easily swayed. This all gets into what you were saying about the charges that Oxford's first daughter was, the rumors that Oxford's first daughter was illegitimate, which were spread perhaps in large part by Roland York, among other people. But it's very interesting. If that analysis is true, if people believe that, it's a very interesting situation to write a play and set yourself up, as two characters, which De Vere does frequently in many other situations, but one of them being a villain here in Measure for Measure, if you see Angelo as the villain.
Alex, I'm going to take another point of view on that, because I think there are different types of villains that cross over the plays, and that those types of villains are actually real individuals in Oxford's life. And for me, Angelo is Robert Cecil. It's that whenever I see that brother relationship, I think about those letters. I mean, brothers-in-law back in the Elizabethan time really was a closeness of brother, this concept of brother-in-law. No, you married somebody, their brother becomes your brother. And so when Oxford is writing those letters to Cecil at the end, and he's talking about ties of family, ties of closeness and brotherhood. But if you think about it, Angelo, as well as Antonio in Tempest, are very much guys who are out for power. They get a taste of it and they hang on to it with everything they've got. They're outsiders to the system. They get a wedge, a foot in the door, and they take over the whole thing. Also to the brother who, and name is escaping me, someone will come up with it, and As You Like It, who usurps from the real Duke, right? Who ends up in the forest of Ardennes. That is the forest of Ardennes in France, not in Stratford-upon-Avon land. But that is somebody who is hypocritical to me, the Cecil figures, somebody who is damaged either physically or mentally in some way, scheming and very much a betrayer. And that type of villainy is very consistent with Robert Cecil. On the other hand, you have villains that are completely charming. And as long as they're top dog and they get what they want, which is just like everything they want, whether it's money or women or power or castles, they're really not going to bother you. Now, they may be poisoners on the side. They may be Claudius in Hamlet, or Tarquin in Lucrece, but, they're likable guys. And that characteristic is very much like Robert Dudley Earl of Leicester. And then, to me, there's a third type, which is the whisperer, the person who is not the hero's equal, but maybe works for the hero or is of a slightly lower class. And that is the Iago in Othello or Giacomo, who causes the worst to come out of the hero in some fashion. And to me, there's Henry Howard. So I see those three people who had real roles at making Oxford's life miserable in different ways, that he puts versions of them in various plays.
Wow, that's really well formulated. Thanks for that little taxonomy.
I see a comment just came in about Shylock. There's one that at least is half of an easy job.
Half hero, half villain. Yeah.
Although a very, very richly drawn character. But the point I wanted to make in terms of villains in Oxford's life, as many people know, Oxford invested 3,000 pounds in an expedition to the Northwest Passage to try to find the Northwest Passage to China. The Frobisher expedition, it was organized by a man named Michael Locke. Oxford originally, as I understand it, was only going to invest 1,000 pounds, and at the last minute, he decided to invest another 2,000. So his stake is 3,000 pounds. The voyage was a complete failure. They brought back some ore from the far north in Canada. The ore was tested. It was proved to be worthless ore. And it's a very short step from losing 3,000 pounds to an expedition put together by a guy named Michael Locke to Antonio in The Merchant of Venice is on the hook, almost literally, for 3,000 ducats to a moneylender named Shylock.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And I've also heard, I think maybe Earl Showerman, but maybe it's other people. I'm sorry if I'm forgetting, that elements of Shylock's dress are reminiscent of like William Cecil and his Jewish gabardine and the way that he's dressed, and certain features of how he keeps his money are kind of reminiscent of William Cecil as well.
Well, we should also point out, I think Earl Showerman did quite a bit of work on this a few years ago to show that at the time Oxford was in Venice, The relationships between the Venetian authorities and the Jewish community were rather strained at the time, and there was a Jewish person named Gaspar Ribeiro, I think was the name, who was a central character, and there were, I believe, legal proceedings against him. So there may have been a real-life model for that character in a sense, but the name, Shylock and Locke is not just coincidence.
Yeah, I also heard it might have been Shalach, like from the Bible, and like Yisker, like Jessica. And so he's sort of anglicizing these names that he would have read in the Hebrew Bible, possibly. No, but that's an interesting one. Yeah. And the Gaspar Ribeiro, I think how he has sort of like some kind of dementia or something. So he keeps repeating words. And so you see that show up.
Yes.
Yeah. Interesting.
Michael Delahoy says Sherlock may have been a villain originally. In revision, he's not. The hypocritical, smug pseudo-Christians are the scum.
Yeah.
And then a nice comment here, discussions like this make me sad for Stratfordians. They're really missing out.
Yeah, for real.
How about the sonnets?
Well, I've got two things. One is I think Robert Cecil arguably shows up as a villain in the sonnets, as Captain Eel in Sonnet 66. And I would also say the real villain in the sonnets is time.
Yes, it is. Eating at it. And that's a theme in the plays as well, but certainly in the sonnets, you feel it the most clearly.
It's interesting, Dorothea, like hearing you lay out the different types of villains, because I thought in preparation for this, it would be fun to, to look and see, okay, like a devil's advocate type of thing and find sort of charming or winning anecdotes or sympathetic examples of the people that we're talking about as they show up in the plays. And I definitely feel like the flashy kind of, like the Robert Dudley ones, like the kind of the charmers, those are really hard. It's really hard to like those snakes. Those people are unlikable. But the Cecils, I feel that the Cecils, I brought in some, this is, could I read some of like kind of what I gathered as sort of, so this is, I really like this. This is a book by David Loades called The Cecils. And this is the last paragraph in the book. He goes, above all, perhaps it should be emphasized that in an age in which politics were supposedly dominated by the court and the personality of the monarch, neither William nor Robert were courtiers, neither held any important court office or played a leading role in entertainments, except by acting as hosts to the court on progress. Both were public servants and civilians of a kind more familiar to later generations. William maintained his position largely by disagreeing with Elizabeth and then carrying out her instructions. Robert by agreeing with James and then persuading him to change his mind. They were remarkable individuals with the ability to survive and influence some of their age's most important events. Between them, they were a phenomenon of government, and without them, Elizabeth possibly and James almost certainly would have self-destructed. Which I thought was an interesting perspective. I have more. I have a lot. I have my apologia for the Cecils, so I can keep going until people get bored. But I had a quote that Earl said that I liked, where he's like, I praise William Cecil for being the man that helped make Shakespeare Shakespeare. He's the embodies the Jungian identifier of the Senex, whereas Oxford is the puer. And they were like opposite poles on this psychological spectrum of creativity and wildness versus determined, organized, and power-oriented forceful application of will. And this is William Cecil defending himself in his own memoranda. So basically when he's fighting with Edward de Vere and Edward de Vere won't see Anne Cecil, he writes notes to himself kind of stating out his case. Maybe he's drafting a letter, but he's very outraged. And so this is a list that he makes defending all the nice things that he did for Edward de Vere. And also I'm going to get into some things that he accuses Oxford of having done. So he goes, during his minority, I preserved his title to his earldom, the Lord Windsor attempting to have made him illegitimate. I did my best to have the jury find the death of a poor man whom he killed in my house to be found se defendendo. I preserved his possessions from encumbrances of titles. I made a lease that William Cardinal claimed from his father of certain pastures for his provisions to be free, whereafter he granted them away. I suffered no wood sales in any of his lands to be made, but left them all void for himself. Then there's one line here that goes, I did allow him so largely for his exhibition that the Queen Majesty had, and then I'm taking this from a Monstrous Adversary, Alan Nelson. Alan Nelson says, after it says so much for his exhibition that the Queen Majesty has, and then it says ends abruptly. So I guess William Cecil didn't want to write down whatever he did with. or whatever that is. But sorry, there's a longer, I'm going to just get through the
I
list.
know. No, I was going to say, but we know that William Cecil rewrites history for
Right.
himself. And we also know that the person who really destroyed Oxford's lands was
Yes.
Lear, who did the things that Cecil says, I didn't do them. But what Cecil's not saying is who did do them.
Right.
Yeah.
But I think the fact that he's saying that, Edward de Vere killed somebody in his house and he had the jury, he pulled strings, that's legitimate. I guess the Lord Windsor wanted his earldom to be taken away and he stood up for him. So that's legitimate. And he goes, Earl of Oxford, ungratefulness to me that brought him up carefully and bountifully. I took care of his possessions, despite his inhumanity to his wife whom he first sought, which I thought is very interesting that he says the wife whom he first sought. Yeah, I didn't buy that one. Contempt of God and of all good orders, arguing always against the articles of faith, wasting of his patrimony, arguments of unkindness both towards my daughter, his wife, and me also, nota rejecting of her from his company, nota regarding his child born of her, my care to get him money when his servants had none, my dealing with his creditors to stay their clamors for their debts, my particular suits to her majesty for his advancement to places of service, and namely to be master of the horse, as her majesty herself can testify. Reports of my uncourteous or and then this is the last one. He's offended. Reports of my uncourteous or untrusty dealing with him in absence and thereof no proof. So basically, he's upset that Edward de Vere has been going around saying that he was untrustworthy and took advantage of him in terms of business.
But does Oxford ever write William Cecil in as a villain? I mean, I don't think Polonius is a villain.
Right.
I mean, so I for me, that relationship is, I'm going to say it's just neutral on both sides. It's both plus and minus. I mean, Cecil was absolutely notorious for rewriting the truth to suit himself. So, this sort of thought process that he goes to, I take him at 50% all the time, and he's always making the Cecils look good. And for that, we Americans would say, great job. The English aristocracy, not so much at the time, but that, rising up of this middle class. I mean, he committed treason against Queen Mary. He kept an illegal press. He used other people's names to write propaganda, both for and against Elizabeth's policy. So, I mean, Cecil's got his own backwater, but I certainly don't view him as a villain. He's just a major force. Now, maybe Mildred is another story.
Yeah.
But William, I think there's some affection there between them, even though they frustrate each other.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. He was easier to find sympathetic stuff than Robert Cecil, but I feel bad for him because he's all right, this is my one thing in favor of Robert Cecil, which I found commendable and legitimate, which is basically, his whole life, and this is a very vain, proud culture, and you see the vanity of and the kind of, the kind of thin-skinnedness and the fast temper of all of these courtiers, from Edward de Vere to Henry Rosalie to the Earl of Essex to all these people. And the thing about Robert Cecil is his whole career, his whole life, people are making fun of him. They're saying, oh, he's perfect to be secretary because he's carrying his back. His back's already good to be a writing desk. He's the ape. He's the little beagle. People are constantly, even like the Richard III thing, it's pretty rough. It's basically calling him this incel who's hideous, and that's why, imagine seeing something like that of yourself on stage. But he seems to, even once James is king, he seems to have this policy of let him hate. You can say anything you want about me. You can make fun of me for being physically deformed. You can say whatever you want, but I'm here to defend the policies of the monarch and to sort of gatekeep on that. And so his ability to sort of let it kind of wash over him as people are just saying incredibly nasty things about him constantly in a way that's really vicious. That to me is, and still get the job done. He's just whatever, I'm still going to keep working. And then there's a story of and it's a little complicated because I think he's sort of using Walter Raleigh in this story, but there's booty, there's a ship of booty, lots and lots of booty, and then it all gets plundered. The mariners all kind of steal it. And he's like, all right, guys, we're getting the booty back together. It belongs to Queen Elizabeth. And so he has Walter Raleigh, he springs him from prison, who was kind of there because of him in the first place a little bit. But he says, Walter Raleigh's going to help me. He gets all the prison back. He spends the whole week inventorying everything. everything. He pockets none of it in this instance, and he gets it all back for Queen Elizabeth. And so that shows like that's a civil servant. Like he shows that he's, organized, he's doing the work, he's, detail oriented, and it's, professional level operation in a way that despite, he didn't have to aim so high, he could have hung out.
He could have, but he also.
I'm getting wrecked by lawyer Dorothea Dickerman. This is the worst.
All of that is true. And
I'm not arguing. I'm just this is
yeah.
Just
but on the other hand, a tremendous amount of jealousy, right? Particularly against Robert Devereux, Earl of Essex. They were almost contemporaries, as a matter of fact. And when Leicester probably poisons Devereux's father in order to make his mother, the lovely Lettice, the 10-year younger lookalike for Queen Elizabeth, that he ultimately marries, to make her available again. And Devereux comes to the house, and Devereux is tall and good looking, and he's got this, a head of curly hair, and he's very athletic, and he's very affable. And you can just imagine how Robert must have felt about that. And Robert sets him up, right? Robert waits. He's like a mafiosi boss. He waits for decades to set Devereux up. He, moves the pieces on the chessboard and boxes Devereux in, knowing Devereux's weaknesses. And he plays it beautifully. And he's able to cut his head off after a trial, right? So was Devereux really going to harm the Queen? Was he really going to harm the state? Was he really going to take over? No, none of that was true. But something made it look that way.
Keeping an eye on the comments, people are making wonderful comments here. There's one question that I want to go back to, a specific one from Catherine. Did Leicester meddle with Oxford's estates?
Oh, yes. Oh, yes, absolutely. So Leicester was Oxford's godfather. So there's a quasi-religious, what shall I say, relationship there. Yeah. And so Leicester was appointed by Elizabeth when Oxford was 12 to take care of Oxford's estates. And what he did was to siphon all the rents off and never put a single pound into repairing anything. And so when Oxford got those back 11 years later, because Elizabeth didn't return them to him for 2 years after he should have gotten them, she was holding on to them because his father had tremendous debts to the crown, which the Lord Protector Thomas Seymour had essentially bamboozled John de Vere. And those debts came to rest on Oxford at 21. They weren't his. He had no responsibility. So he got back these lands that were very far-flung, in tremendous disrepair, falling apart, holes in the ceilings all over the country. And Leicester had taken all the money. I mean, Leicester was so mean that Oxford's mom, Marjorie, on her lands that she brought to the marriage to John, it's I'm a real estate lawyer by profession. There's an old common law rule that if you put crops in the ground, even if you sell them, even if you lease the land, you get the rights to reap those crops. Leicester would not even let her collect the corn on her own land. So we're talking about somebody who was just squeezing the pennies from the earldom from the moment he got permission to do so.
So if he had that much control, why wasn't Leicester the guardian of de Vere then?
Because William Cecil had just been set up with the Court of Wards by Elizabeth. And so Oxford's guardianship, right, and the rights to his marriage, which is extremely valuable, went to Cecil as master of the Court of Wards. Oxford was his first ward. Southampton was his last. And all of the wardships in the entire kingdom went through Cecil. And what he did for ones that he wanted, those were just never sold. They were just kind of an off-the-book transaction. Cecil kept them. And of course, these young boys were very much privileged to be in Cecil House. There was a tremendous benefit to being Burleigh's ward, but it all came at a cost.
It always does. Yeah.
Interesting how we strayed a little bit away from the topic of villain.
We did.
Well, to get back to a little bit towards villains, I wanted to make 2 points. One, let's always keep in mind, though, that certainly we almost all agree that Oxford revised his works over time.
Oh, yeah.
So it's quite possible that a certain villain may have been characterized one way in the earliest stages or performances of a particular play, and then changed somewhat by the time the printed versions that we have today came into existence. One possible example I would cite would be Richard III, another quintessential villain character who even goes as far as to make an aside to the audience that says, "I'm a villain," as if the audience needs education about this particular point. Eva Turner Clarke believes that the play was written in 1581 when Oxford himself was in the Tower of London. One of the things she points out is that that play mentions the Tower more than any other play in the Shakespearean canon. So she thinks it's redolent of Tower atmosphere. And yet, at that time, if she's right, if it's 1581, Robert Cecil, who now most of us think is the analog of Richard III because of the physical deformity, the hunchback, and so on and so forth, Robert Cecil was only 18 years old at the time. So he was not really in 1581 to be in a position of much enmity or antagonism toward Oxford, I would think, at that early an age. So that's something that may have changed over time. And then the second point that I wanted to make is Oxford also knew, and maybe his attitudes changed a little bit over time, that another way that you could portray your enemies in an unfavorable light is to make fools of them and to lampoon them. And this, of course, is what he did with some of his bitterest enemies, back to the Arundels and the Howards, who were originally villains, or at least Arundel is. But yet in Much Ado About Nothing, they're just viciously lampooned there. And likewise, the character Polonius is a lampoon. I'm not saying that William Cecil, again, is a villain, but Oxford's best revenge might not have been to
The villains, yeah.
draw somebody as a villain, but rather to make fun of them.
That's a really good point. That's a really good point.
You touched on Much Ado there, and Bob Proctor was reading my mind. He says, don't forget Don John. Even
Sure.
like Iago, both break up a couple. Is Howard the model for that?
And also, in terms of the Harold, like this, when Dorothea was talking about Tweedledee, Tweedledum, I was thinking about Earl Showerman talking about how Pandarus in Troilus and Cressida is sort of a composite maybe of Howard and Arundel, and this idea that they're kind of pimping out Anne Vavasor as Cressida, and just how creepy and gross they are. So it's, again, very different sides. If that's also, Rosencrantz and Guildenstern, and then that's also, I guess, like Dogberry and, Much Ado and stuff. It's interesting that, you see them through these different prisms. And I agree that probably lampooning them in court would have been the most effective revenge, as opposed to, giving them the power of being a villain.
Maybe we should do another episode on lampooning as a topic.
Well, I think that's a great idea, and I could see Elizabeth exerting her power, if you will, by watching her courtiers fight amongst each other, divide and rule. But I still don't quite understand why she herself would allow herself to be lampooned in some situations. Do you agree that that's even a concept?
Well, he's an allowed fool.
He's an allowed fool, yeah.
It must get so boring. Everybody's constantly worshiping you, praising your beauty, especially after I think she's deeply insecure about her like skin and getting older and the smallpox scars and stuff. Whereas everybody has to constantly tell her she's so beautiful. And so there's this horrible dissonance. And so I think having somebody that knows how to make you laugh at yourself must be so cathartic. It's so needed, you know, in this stuffy, phony atmosphere.
Okay. That's
I have this is kind of meditating on the difference between villains and fools. This is what Edmund Spenser wrote a poem after Robert Dudley died, which is interesting because it's even this idea of like, okay, so you know, you upgrade a fool and they're even more powerful, so then they're a villain. But this is basically the theme of this short poem is just about how he's dead and we all had to praise him while he was alive, but now he's basically forgotten, you know? So that's almost like the worst possible thing is that he goes, he is now dead and all his glory's gone and all his greatness vapored to naught, that as a glass upon the water shone, which vanished quite as soon as it was sought. His name is worn already out of thought. Nay, any poem seeks him to revive, yet many poems honored him alive.
I think everybody except for the Queen heaved an enormous sigh of relief when Robert Dudley breathed last. I think his only true mourner was Elizabeth, and I find I think that you know that to me is Olivia, and that wonderful line where Orsino says, "All of this mourning for a brother," quote unquote. You know, and I think that that dead brother is Leicester, and he's gently prodding her in Twelfth Night, like, you know, you really went over the top when he died because the rest of us are not sorry he's gone.
Yeah. Well, you know, it's interesting. While he was alive, this is one instance in which, so Philip Sidney is in the lowlands. And so he's like a twerp. He's like a kid who's, you know, used to being like, you know, the adolescents who's sort of the proxy for his uncle or his dad and doing kind of foreign courts. But he doesn't, they give him a battalion to lead. And he's like, uh-oh, because, you know, the garrison is leaking and, you know, the morale is in the toilet. And so he's writing his letters to Uncle Lester saying, like, if you arrive here on camp, your arrival will be as celebrated as the Messiah would be by the Jews. So somebody really likes him. Somebody really wants him. But I guess he predeceased him, so he didn't get to write what I'm sure would have been
you know, and for a while there, Sidney had two earldoms, right? He had two uncles who did not have legitimate sons. And so the one standing in line to take both with Warwick and Leicester earldom, and then
But then again, this is me being annoyingly postmodern. But in that very limited context, when Leicester shows up, the troops are like finally a grown-ups in charge, and he does here. Right. He does for a second seem to, you know, he has gravitas, like he has the kind of the power where they think, okay, maybe we can win a victory here. But then it falls apart. Let's just say that. But it's sort of sabotaged by Elizabeth. But that's a whole other story.
I mean, I have to say, you know, there's a part of me that really enjoys Leicester. I mean, his effect in terms of his villainous effect on Oxford's life is devastating, but I kind of enjoy watching him do it. I mean, I get very much a sense of his style and his confidence. His, you know, what is mine. But I've known people who are like that. But you can have the crumbs. You know, I'm willing to let you have your part as long as I get the lion's share and I get to choose what I want first. And with women, it's like, well, who wouldn't want me? You know.
Well, when he's like, when he's secretly writing letters to like every foreign country saying, hey, is there a princess I can marry? But meanwhile, like pretending to be Queen Elizabeth's boyfriend and like charging money to like have a meeting with Queen Elizabeth. Like he's just a little sleaze. And also like Amy Robsart, the pregnant dead.
Murder your wife tomorrow, today, doesn't matter.
Yeah.
She's inconvenient.
She fell down the stairs.
He didn't do it. He's in.
I was nowhere near it. I was nowhere near it.
Fake news. Fake news.
Fake news. Yeah, of course. Literally. Yeah.
I know nothing.
Yeah, there we go.
Yeah. There's wonderful conversations going on the side here between people. And I'm just trying to pick out any questions there might be. I don't see any immediately. So if somebody wants to throw in a question right now.
I I think we got a question. Then we get a question before. Sometimes we get questions before. People just send in emails. We got a question about why are the French such paper tigers in Henry V?
Can I do that?
There was that question. So my answer to that is that you don't need a villain, because the real villains, and it is the hardest part of the play, but the very first scene in Henry V is between the Archbishop of Canterbury and the Bishop of Ely. And they got their heads together and they're saying, we've got this terrible problem with the new king. He wants to take away these lands that are paying money to us as the church. What can we do with him in order to distract him? Hey, let's get him to go invade France, because there is a right through Edward III, his grandfather or great-grandfather, that he has rights to lands in France. So let's go tell him that. And there is a scene which is terribly difficult to follow. Henry V is sitting on his throne. The lords are all there. These two bishops are late and they kind of stumble in. And then the Archbishop of Canterbury has this speech that covers, in my Riverside Shakespeare, 1.5 columns, almost an entire page, where he goes through this recitation about Salic law and how Salic law, in his opinion, is only applicable in Germany because Charles the Bold had a prejudice against German women for some reason. And so the area he defined as having Salic law, that is, that women cannot inherit, only applies in Germany. It has never applied in France. And he goes through this recitation of all the kings of France who have inherited through the female line. And he turns to Henry V as the new king on the throne and says, and you can take advantage of this. Then the tennis balls come in with the insult of Mountjoy from the Dauphin. And then Henry says, we are glad the Dauphin is so pleasant with us. And then goes down their throats and says, I'm invading you. Get ready. So wow. The French don't need to be the villain to set that. The real villain is the two churchmen who are trying to hang on to their funds.
That's crazy. That the whole action of the play ends up being a distraction. He's being manipulated.
That's the mechanism that kicks it off. And so, I think Jens sent this in, and I think he's right. They're not very deep villains. I mean, what can you say about a Dauphin who writes a poem to his most excellent horse? I mean, they're very vain, certainly proud, certainly underestimate the English, but well,
that's almost the Robert Cecil of it, right? Which is to say that, like, you can have the young, lusty young guy can go off to war and feel like he's getting all this attention and is some big hero, but like, who's got the land? Keep your eye on the ball.
This is one of the fastest hours I have ever spent. Well done, you three. That's like a fire hose of information. You are so knowledgeable. It went all over the place, and all of it complemented everything else, I think. So great job. I'm just looking at comments to see if there's any more questions coming in. Fascinating discussion, must leave, says Tom Goff, echoing what I'm saying. So, wow. We're going to have to call it an end here. I'm still looking at, Jens follows up on what you said. I need to throw this in. Jens was the one who made the comment about the French. I've always thought about the clergy in Henry V myself. They're depicted differently in the Branagh movie and in the Olivier movie. So, and then somebody wants to repeat here, and I think it was answered from Bill, was Edward de Vere Queen Elizabeth's allowed fool? I think you agreed he was, right?
Yes, absolutely.
Just want to make sure everybody gets to be heard here who has a question. Lots of wonderful comments coming in for you all. Okay, then, I think I'm about to pull the plug. So,
thank you, Tom.
Evening. Thank you all so much.
Thank you, Tom. Bye-bye.